All right, guys, here we are, part two of the lecture on 1852 to 1859, leaving out Lincoln. So we went over a whole bunch of stuff here already, and we went over how the Transcontinental Railroad led to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which led to Bleeding Kansas, and we were just leaving off with Bleeding Sumner. So what we have is Charles Sumner is a senator from Massachusetts. He is an abolitionist, and all the actions in Bleeding Kansas led him to what's called the Crime Against Kansas speech in 1856. Sumner insults Andrew Butler, who's a South Carolina, basically calls Andrew Butler a pimp, and prostitution is slavery. Preston Brooks, who's actually his cousin and a South Carolina representative, takes great offense to this, walks over to Charles Sumner and proceeds to crack his skull and break his cane over his head. As you see, that does put Charles Sumner, he's out for 3.5 to 4 years, out completely, stays away. From Senate, from politics. Massachusetts reelects him as an abstention to kind of give the middle finger to the South. But the big thing to understand here is, yes, the North was like, wow, that's kind of uncool. But what turns this into Bleeding Sumner is the South's response. At first, the North is going to think this is just one wackadoo. But what happens is Charles Sumner will get vilified in the South. Preston Brooks will get heroified. He will have letters of commendation sent to him. He will receive canes in the mail to replace his broken cane, saying, break it over his head again, stuff like that. So then the North really sees that this isn't one wackadoo, this is an entire section of wackadoos. The event gets titled Bleeding Sumner, and what to understand, especially when we get to Lincoln next lesson, is that Bleeding Sumner and Bleeding Kansas is going to not only help push the membership of the Republican Party up, but it's going to absolutely help push the Republican Party into the second major party, into the two-party system of this country. In 56, they are kind of a third party, but yet they garner, as we're going to see, quite a bit of the electoral vote, and that is what's going to lead to 1860, the possibility of a political party only 6 to 7 years old in its infancy to elect its first president. So we do go to the election of 56. We have the candidates that are Buchanan. He is a Democrat from Pennsylvania. He's kind of a crappy president because he doesn't do anything to stop the Civil War from coming. He runs on a Kansas-less platform. He basically says, I ain't addressing it. I will say popular sovereignty, not a bad idea. And we move on to the Republican, John C. Fremont. He's called the Pathfinder. He fought against some stuff going on in California. That's where he gains his fame. That's how he gets to California. That's how he gets to the presidential nod for the Republicans. Please understand, you will hear the South screaming that the Republicans are they are the abolition party, the anti-slavery party. They are not. Their stance is what we talked about when we talked about the Wilmot Proviso and the North's game plan. The Republicans will absolutely run on a strong platform of, we don't care where slavery is right now, but you cannot allow slavery to expand. And then there's a Millard Fillmore guy. He's the Know Nothing Party. Remember, they're called the Know Nothings because when people ask them about pretty much everything, they go, well, we know nothing. Except if you talk about immigration, then they say immigration sucks. So obviously, they're a Northern party. The results, again, are pretty surprising. Buchanan holds 174. Fremont, the new Republican, comes in at 114. That freaks the South out. How in the world could this brand new political party that represents anti-slavery come in so close? And Millard Fillmore, as who was the terrible joke person, Haley Warzel, says, well, he wasn't very much Phil Moore. He was Phil less. Pretty terrible. Anyway, moving on. Next major thing that happens is the Dred Scott versus Sanford Supreme Court case of 1857. Dred Scott is a slave, basically. He basically sues for his own freedom in federal courts in Missouri. Make a long story short, here's Dred Scott's story. He's a slave. He's born in the South. He gets sold. He gets bounced around. He actually travels into free territory, specifically in Wisconsin. He's going to live on his own for 2 or 3 years with a family, his family, I should say. Get married, all kinds of stuff. He's going to live as a free person. And the debate is going to be, if you live in a free territory where slavery does not exist, how can you be a slave if slavery does not exist? Make a long story short, Sanford is like the grandson of his original master. He wants him back because, again, this is property, this is value. So what ends up happening? is Dred Scott sues for his freedom against Sanford in 1857. He goes to federal court, low level, loses, goes to the next level, wins, goes to the Supreme Court, loses. So that makes him appeal it all the way up to the Supreme Court. Remember, we call Supreme Courts by their Chief Justice's names. This is the Taney Court. Chief Justice Robert Taney is going to be a slave owner from the South. Yay, him. Along with 6 other Supreme Court justices. So when you're talking about a 9-person Supreme Court, that's how it always is to avoid ties. You're going to have 7-2 of slave-holding Southerners against 2 non-slave-holding Southerners. And guess what the vote is going to be? 7-2 that Dred Scott should remain a black slave. It's a very sectionalist Southern court. Judge Taney will remember there's a majority opinion and a dissenting opinion. If there's a vote like that's broken, Taney will write the majority opinion. It will say, first off, Scott loses because he is not a citizen. He is not afforded the protections under the Constitution of the United States, which means he shouldn't have even sued in federal courts to begin with. Hence, no slave can sue hereforth. Why is he not a citizen under the Constitution? Because he and all slaves are technically property, even though they're human beings. This goes over fantastic in the North. Because they are property, and because the Constitution says there cannot be any unlawful search and seizure of property, and your right to property is protected under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution, property can never be taken from you. Therefore, you can bring property wherever you want. That makes any ban anywhere on slavery unconstitutional. That violates the Missouri Compromise. Remember the 3630 line? Not only does it violate the Missouri Compromise, Taney writes that the Missouri Compromise has been unconstitutional since its inception in 1820. This goes over really, really poorly in the North, goes over phenomenally in the South. And one of the reasons is historiography would tell you that a bunch of modern scholars agree that if a court case were to come, Taney would probably rule that slavery is available in free states. It's that states' rights argument. States versus federal rights. You see it today with the marijuana legislation in Colorado and Washington. That actually violates federal law against drugs, but yet it's a state right, supposedly. They're still in that debate. Well, this is a state versus federal right. The state should be allowed to make laws regarding slavery. Well, if some slave owner drug a bunch of slaves up into Lancaster County and decided to set up a plantation in 1858, and that court case went to court, PA versus whoever, scholars agree that Taney would probably rule that since you can't take away territory based on can't take away property based on the Fifth Amendment, Pennsylvania cannot disallow slavery. That's a big deal. And again, when you think of states' rights arguments, that's what the South is going to lean on. It is our state right. We're not fighting for slavery. We're fighting for states' rights. Well, right there, there's a states' right that could be taken away completely by this Supreme Court decision, which the South was just thrilled with. Just to muddy the waters a little bit, the crash of 1957. Guys, make a long story short, there's a bunch of stuff going on. You're seeing over-speculation. You're seeing overproduction. You're seeing, gold flood the market, which means the North is going to be smoked. Remember, the stock market is going to affect businesses. So that's going to affect the North. That's going to make the South laugh at the North. And what's going to happen at the end of the day is the North is going to be trying to get some protectional tariffs against imported goods, which again is going to piss off the South if you go all the way back to the nullification crisis. So it's just another thing to muddy the waters and really push North versus South. When you look at it, then we move on to the Lincoln-Douglas debates. Lincoln-Douglas debates, basically, guys, this is just another thing to know. It was for the senatorial election in 1858. You had Lincoln, the Republican, versus Stephen Douglas, the Democrat. As you see, guys, don't believe that Lincoln rose from nothing to president. He rose from nothing, to be sure, but he wasn't nothing before he got to be president. He got 110 votes for vice president with the Republican Party in 1856. He was a U.S. representative, so he was a pretty established politician by the time 1860 rolls around. But he's the incumbent, Stephen Douglas. He's the champion of popular sovereignty of the Kansas-Nebraska bill, which scarred him a little bit. But still, people in Illinois are going to dig him because he's trying to get that transcontinental railroad and bring a ton of money into Illinois. There's a list of like 7 debates. Make a long story short, what happens comes out here is the Freeport Doctrine. Freeport Doctrine is when Douglas says that Dred Scott sucks, and basically what happens there is if you say the Dred Scott decision sucks, that's going to piss off the entire South. And what that means is that Douglas is going to break apart the Democrats. Douglas is going to win the Senate seat in 58, but what's going to happen is the Democrats are now going to be completely split. You're going to have Southern Democrats going, wait, this guy's a loon. You're going to have Northern Democrats going, wait, no, he has a point. And you're going to now have a Northern Democratic Party, a Southern Democratic Party, and Lincoln stock is going to rise for standing up to Stephen Douglas. And again, when we get to the election of 1860 in the next lesson, you're going to see that split of the Democrats is what's going to allow Lincoln to be elected. It would be like a vote today, 2016 election. If you have the Democrats are split between 2 candidates, you have all the Democrats voting for either this guy or that guy, well, that means the Republicans are going to win because they're just going to get more votes, and that's what happens. Another big deal, raided Harper's Ferry. John Brown, the loon from, or we should call him terrorist or freedom fighter, however you want to look at the historiography of the subject, from Potawatomi massacre fame. He wants to incite a slave rebellion, basically have all the slaves join him and march out west and create a free slave colony because God is talking to him and telling him to do it every day. He meets with the Secret Six, who are his financiers from the North, again, abolitionists that promote getting rid of slavery now. Their plan is basically they're going to go down with a whopping 20-dude army, and they are going to take over the largest arsenal in the area at Harper's Ferry, Virginia. At the time, it becomes West Virginia. And all the slaves around are going to be like, oh, that's awesome. And they're going to run to the armory. John Brown and his 20 are going to supply them. Now they'll have an army of thousands, and they'll march out west. It happened in October of 1859. Yep, a whopping 20 dudes, and not a single slave joins him. So it's him and 20 dudes. They end up stopping a train, killing some innocent people on the train. Slaves are like, yeah, we no thanks. And what ends up happening is the U.S. Marines under the command, remember these names, of Robert E. Lee, Colonel, and his second in command, J.E.B., Jeb Stuart, will capture Brown and his men. He will be convicted of murder and treason in federal court. There will be an insanity plea. Nobody will believe it. Here's the thing, though. When he is killed, now you have a giant fracture again of the North and South. The South is going to be saying the guy's a loon, a crazy, and thank God he got killed because, remember, the South lives under constant threat of slave rebellion, and for a white dude to incite a slave rebellion is just beyond them. You're going to have a white dude help the slaves rise up and kill all of us white dudes. That's just craziness. The North, though, is going to see him as a martyr for a good cause. Is going to see him as someone who is trying to push the agenda of bringing the country together under the guise of freedom. So it's going to be a giant fracture, and this is going to cause the South. Remember, when we get to practices of the Civil War, South's going to whoop butt for about 2 years because guess what happens right after the raid at Harper's Ferry? They are going to start, now you got the PEMs, you got the M, the military coming in. They are going to form state militias all over the place because if those white dudes are going to come down here and incite slave riots, we're going to be able to get together at a moment's notice and kill them quickly. And that's what's going to cause a much, much better and bigger Southern response at the beginning of the Civil War because they are going to form militias and they are going to be ready. And they're going to actually be training for a war. They don't know it's called the Civil War, maybe a slave war, but they're going to be training for it from Harper's Ferry on. So please remember that. And we had reading checks, and that's it. So that's part 2. Be ready for your timed writing. That should help. And there are review questions on Schoology that this presentation should have helped that. Have a great weekend, and see you for your timed writings on Monday and Tuesday.